Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Sarah Gledhill with the Florida Wildlife Federation. And, thank you for all the folks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube for joining us and the panelists tonight. Here at the Florida Wildlife Federation, our mission is to safeguard Florida's water, wildlife, and wild spaces by taking action today to prevent irreversible loss tomorrow. And tonight, that mission has brought us here together to talk about one of the most urgent threats facing our southeast coastline. Off the coast of Fort Lauderdale lies a reef unlike anywhere else in Florida. It is the last place in the entire state where endangered staghorn corals exist, with queen conch breeding grounds, two iconic and imperiled species sharing the same fragile ecosystem. It took thousands of years to build, and right now it is in danger. And you're going to hear more about that. A major dredging expansion at Port Everglades threatens to smother this reef under sediment plumes, not for a week, not for a month, but for more than 5 years. We've seen what that looks like at Port Miami. Dredging between 2013 and 2015 destroyed nearly 300 acres of reef. The restoration promises made in the wake of that destruction still have not been fulfilled, and we cannot let that happen again. FWF and our partners have been fighting to protect this reef for more than 10 years. Tonight is not the beginning of this story, but it may be one of its most critical chapters. NOAA is reviewing this project right now, and we are calling on Congress to halt it until the Army Corps of Engineers commits to real science and enforceable protections. Your presence here tonight matters. Public pressure is part of what gets heard. That's why we've brought together 3 people on the front lines of this fight: a scientist who knows the data, an attorney who knows the law, and a local dive business owner who knows exactly how these threats can impact our ecotourism here in Florida. Together, we're going to break down what's at stake, where things stand, and what you can do to make a difference. The reef cannot speak for itself, but tonight we will. So I have the honor of introducing you to our panelists tonight. First, we have Dr. Rachel Silverstein. She is the CEO of Miami Waterkeeper, where she's led landmark wins on coral reef protection, pollution, and climate accountability since 2014. Her work is grounded in science. She holds a PhD from the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School, where her doctoral research focused on climate change impacts on coral reefs. She's a nationally recognized leader, a 2023 Elevate Prize winner, and a full circle moment for us, a Florida Wildlife Federation Water Conservationist of the Year. She's also been a certified scuba diver since the age of 14, so she knows these reefs personally, and this is a personal mission for her. Donica Desai is an attorney at Earth Justice, based with the organization's Oceans Program. She works both internationally and domestically on a broad range of ocean conservation issues, including combating offshore oil and gas, promoting sustainable fisheries, and protecting marine biodiversity. Her work includes legal research and writing, commenting on regulatory actions, work with experts, drafting motions and briefs, and presenting legal arguments in court. And rounding out our panel tonight, we have a new invitee that wasn't quite advertised on our marketing materials for this live stream, but Shayna Fellon. She is the owner of Pura Vida Divers, bringing both scientific expertise and on-the-ground knowledge of our local marine ecosystem to tonight's conversation. A marine biologist and coastal environmental management expert, Shayna has researched endangered sea turtles, co-created a sea turtle trauma response field guide used across the Caribbean, and logged countless dives in the reef systems that run through this region of Florida. She also is a Florida Wildlife Federation Conservation Award winner. She currently serves as diving vice chair of the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Initiative, giving her direct insight into the waters we're discussing tonight. So thank you all for your time tonight to educate the community about this critical issue. For the folks who are listening in and watching online, at the end of our discussion tonight, we'll have a Q&A with you. So you can ask your own questions by dropping them in the comments, and we will be monitoring those. So settle in. And right now, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Rachel Silverstein, who is going to provide a presentation and visuals about the background on this project. Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah, and for hosting this live stream. You all have been incredible partners for over 10 years now, working to protect this reef, and so grateful, as well as, of course, Earth Justice and the Dive Equipment and Marketing Association. So we're so grateful to the dive industry and the people who are using the reefs every day to join this fight to protect them. So thank you again for having us, and you summarized everything so beautifully as to where we are in this critical moment. And as I said, I want to take you through a little bit over the last 10 years of how we got here. And it really starts in Port Miami and the dredging project that happened there. So I want to now present, and I don't know if you all can see my screen now or not. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. And let me know if you have any issues or delays, but I'm actually going to take off my camera so that the presentation will hopefully play that. Turn off camera. But so this work and this project goes back to the dredging of Port Miami from 2013 to 2015. Did the slide change? Having a little delay with the slide. Not moving. There we go. Nope. There we go. So way back in 2014, I had just started as Miami waterkeeper, and I had finished my PhD studying corals in Miami. I had gone to work in the U.S. Senate, and I came back to run Miami Waterkeeper, which had been started, but I was the only staff member. Thought I'd spend a couple months reading books about nonprofit management, and spoiler alert, it has been 12 years and I have never read a book on nonprofit management still. But that is because on my fourth day, I got a call from the New York Times, and they were getting reports that corals were being buried in the port of Miami from a dredging project that was deepening and widening the shipping channel in an effort to make way for these supersized post-Panamax ships that were coming through the newly expanded Panama Canal, and were kicking up these plumes of sediment, and there were reports that corals were being buried. So kind of said, when's your deadline? And let me figure out what's going on. And some intrepid folks had challenged the permit to this project before, and I started kind of gathering information, and within a pretty short amount of time, I realized Endangered Species Act, because there were staghorn corals in the area that had not been relocated when they were supposed to, and were being harmed by this dredging project. So this sent me on a course to try to call the Army Corps of Engineers and to try to get them to stop harming the corals, which they kind of said, we're not giving you any information. You have to do formal Information Act requests. We're not going to coffee with you. And we're not stopping the dredging project, basically. So a few weeks later, I got together with local attorney Jim Porter, who unfortunately passed away from brain cancer a few years ago, but he was our attorney on almost everything we did in those early years. And he just loved Biscayne Bay and protecting its ecosystem. So he jumped in to help. And a few weeks later, we were with our incredible partners present here tonight, filing Endangered Species Act lawsuit, and going out to inspect the reefs to look for the damage ourselves. So Jim was our attorney, but also boat captain, and I was also the diver. So we kind of pulled up to this dredge ship to see what was going on, and took a giant stride off the side and kind of wondered, why are we diving right next to this giant dredge ship with this ripping current, and took a leap off the side of the boat and into the water, and immediately knew something was very wrong. And instead of having a colorful, vibrant reef like we're used to seeing, it was a total moonscape. It was lifeless. It was colorless. It was, I thought, a sandbar. I thought we got the coordinates wrong, and this is not actually the reef. This is wrong spot. And then as we're diving, came to realize what we were seeing here, this moonscape, where you could hardly see your hand in front of your face, and you could feel the vibrations of the dredge ship right next to you. It sounded like somebody was eating a car underwater. It was this crunching metallic sound. I started swimming over what looked like this, and you could see sea fans and sea whips kind of sticking out of the sand. And corals, by definition, have to be attached to exposed rock. They can't just grow out of the sand. And I started to realize I was swimming, and I swam as far as I could on the tank of air and saw no end of this. That this was the reef, and that it had been completely buried in what we later learned was very deep sediment from the dredging project. And let's see if I can get to the next slide. So we knew the damage was very widespread and severe. And for their part, the Army Corps of Engineers essentially denied that there was any damage. They said there's no damage, nothing happened. Environmentalists, like all of us present here tonight, have made up the fact that there was all this damage to the reef. And they even filed this photo in federal court that they used as evidence that in 2016, so after the dredging project was 2013 to 2015, so this was right after the dredging project, in 450 meters away from the port channel, that the reef looked fine, and it looked like this. And this was a healthy staghorn coral with a damselfish and Porites coral, and it all looked fine, and we had made it up. And as I'm staring at it, I realized there's this little watermark in the corner, a little copyright. And I looked it up, and I found the photographer online at the Right Blue. And I realized that this photo had not been taken at Port Miami, as they had told the court, but instead the photographer confirmed it was taken in 1992 in the Cayman Islands. And so they had to retract the photo. And actually, we wrote letters to the Army Corps about the dishonesty of the photo. They did the same thing again 2 weeks later with a different photo at a Port Everglades meeting, which I'll talk about in a second. But it was clearly a pattern of dishonesty. And eventually the Army Corps biologists who had filed this ended up getting indicted by the Department of Justice, nothing to do with us, but for lying about taking money from a major an environmental monitoring firm on a major South Florida dredging project that was never named. But there was clearly a lot of dishonesty and a clear attempt to cover up the impacts in the Port Miami project. And the impacts were widespread and severe. So that cover up extended also to the environmental monitoring firm who was hired by the dredging company to monitor the corals. And sorry, I'm having trouble with the slides skipping ahead and not turning. Going back. a little bit here. But essentially, the environmental monitoring firm on the project, this was their final report. So they came back 1 year after the dredging had ended. They resurveyed the reef. They said, oh, only 6 corals were killed, and that this represents the only permanent impact of the project. The only impact that they documented. And we knew that this couldn't be the end of the story, or else the damage that was happened that we knew was widespread and severe from all the dives and all the monitoring we had done during the project, we had to set the record straight. So we got together with my PhD advisor, Andrew Baker, my PhD colleague, Ross Cunning, and Brian Barnes from University of South Florida to do satellite monitoring. And we went back to the beginning. We looked at all the data that had been produced in the project, and we reanalyzed it using really robust statistics. It took us over a year, and we ultimately ended up publishing a paper in 2019 showing that likely millions of corals were killed in the project. And it wasn't until 2024 when NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, eventually published their impact report of the project. Litigation, of course, able to get some restoration of the reef. The 10,000 corals were restored by the Rescue a Reef program at University of Miami within 3 years of the settlement of the project. And they were some of the first staghorn corals observed to be reproducing in the wild after restoration. This is not exactly them, but this is an example of a healthy staghorn thicket. And this was sort of a silver lining, but that's 10,000 of these Endangered Species Act listed staghorn corals, which are critically important. They used to blanket the Caribbean. So there used to be miles and miles and miles of these corals that make up thickets. And you can see how many fish are living in and around them. The branches make ideal habitat for fish. So they support healthy fish populations. And this used to be the dominant coral in Florida. And unfortunately, it's become the first coral, along with elkhorn coral, that also has these big branches, but they're much thicker. The first coral listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act in 2006. And so this coral formed the basis of our litigation because there were too many corals in the area that hadn't been moved, they hadn't been monitored, and they were being adversely impacted by the sediment, as well as the reef habitat itself that was being taken. But that's 10,000 of this species of corals that fell under the jurisdiction of our litigation. But there are still millions of corals and 270 acres of reef that were never fixed. And the state, the county have never done the proper analysis or mitigation to fix the holistic damage from the project. And so that's still outstanding in Miami. And typically they do boulder reef restoration when they destroy corals. And this has been the standard sort of since the 1970s, but we just don't have enough corals anymore to continue doing this, because corals won't just come and grow these days. You have to actually attach them on the boulder reefs in order to make a new reef, because there just aren't enough corals where they'll interbreed and come naturally. So this is sort of the old way to do coral restoration and mitigation, and it costs about $1 to $5 million an acre at least. So if you're counting 278 acres, and $5 million an acre, you're talking over $1 billion to make up for the damage from this project. We can risk capacity, but we need to get to be able to restore millions of corals. So this is obviously an AI generated image of a futuristic, cool looking robotic coral lab. And I'm not saying it's this exactly, but this is the scale that we need to be thinking, and we need to be thinking about technology and like warehouses full of corals that we can then deploy to make up for not only Port Miami mitigation, but reefs that are being naturally lost from things like climate change, warming oceans, ocean acidification, damage from projects like these coastal construction projects, sewage leaks, septic tanks, things like that. And of course, Port Miami was followed closely on the heels of the Port Everglades planned dredging project. And that's just 30 miles north in Fort Lauderdale. There's also a channel there at Fort Lauderdale where the port channel crosses right across the Florida Reef Tract. And back in 2016, look at these amazing partners here. Since 2016, we filed a lawsuit because they were planning to start this dredging project in 2017, and they had not considered the lessons learned or fixed the mistakes that they had made in in Port Miami to prevent the same exact thing from happening at Port Everglades. So they were minimizing the impact, they were underestimating, they weren't planning for proper mitigation and monitoring, and we couldn't let that happen. So we filed this lawsuit. They almost immediately said, yeah, you're right. We need to go back and redo our environmental assessments. So they went back to the drawing board. They started to, because we forced them to redo some of the science, and we still don't think they're doing an amazing job at the science, but it's getting a little bit better to where they're estimating closer to the right levels of impact. Although, of course, we still think they're underestimating. But when they did that, they started to realize, oh my goodness, there are hundreds of thousands to millions of corals that are going to be killed in this project. And we don't really know how to do this project without doing that scale of damage. And we, of course, went out diving to document that this is one of the last places in Florida that still has robust staghorn coral populations that are naturally occurring. And NOAA said that this project would result in one of the largest impacts to coral reefs permitted in US history. So that is a huge deal. And a later NOAA report said, not only that, but this would result in one of the largest impacts to Endangered Species Act listed individuals permitted in US history. So the scale of what is being planned at Port Everglades even dwarfs what they were planning at Port Miami. And Port Miami was a 2.5 year long dredging project, more or less. This is going to be a 6-year long dredging project. And they're getting permission to do over 200 days of blasting. That's underwater blasting that will affect dolphins, turtles, fish in the area. We think this is one of the locations of a little known and little documented snook aggregation. And in addition to that, NOAA was still as of 2024 saying that there are significant factual flaws and are unintelligible in some parts, which is why I say we're still not thrilled with the science, even if it's trending in the right direction and is better than Port Miami somewhat. And it's also, in addition to being one of the last places with thriving wild populations of staghorn corals left in Florida, it is also one of the last known breeding populations of queen conch. So there are tens of thousands of queen conch that live in this area. And where corals are sensitive to centimeters of sediment, conch may be sensitive to millimeters of sediment. So even more sensitive than corals to sedimentation stress. And for whatever reason that we still don't understand, the staghorn corals are still holding on here. The conch is still holding on here, where in the rest of Florida, they're starting to disappear. And in fact, just a few months ago, a paper came out declaring the staghorn and elkhorn corals of Florida functionally extinct throughout Florida. And one of the last places, again, that they can be found is right around Port Everglades. So we're contemplating a project that will do 6 years of dredging, 200 days of blasting, will likely kill some of the last thriving populations of staghorn corals left in the whole state, as well as conch. And one of the things that's happening right now is a smaller dredging project has started, and it's called the Sand Bypass Project. They're dredging a big sand pit right now at Port Everglades. We weren't paying too much attention to it because it was supposed to be smaller. They made a lot of promises about tightly controlling sediment and monitoring it very closely. But what we're finding is that that project is also producing huge plumes of sediment and potentially impacting corals and reef habitat at Port Everglades right now, on top of all of these, really critical corals that we're trying to protect in the big dredging project. They may be even wiped out in this little dredging project. So we're working actively on that right now, but we're finding this same things happening again. Poor data management. They're not following the terms and conditions that they're supposed to be protecting the corals. So we have collectively worked on this massive campaign together as all of our partners. You can scan the QR code or go to stopthedredge.com, and you can sign a petition. You can send emails to your elected officials. Be sure to follow us all on social media. We post about this all the time, and we will give you real-time updates as to what's happening on the ground. If there are any Broward County residents, we also encourage you, we have an action alert out right now also to call your commissioners and mayor and make sure that they are aware that you care about the reefs and you're concerned about the project that's going on now and the one that's planned in the future, because you want to see the reef. This is what the reef looks like right now. I don't know how to turn off the sound, but if you can still hear me, there are these massive plumes of sediment from the Sand Bypass Project, and you can see how severe this is and widespread if it's playing. I'm not sure if it's playing still or not, but we remain extremely concerned. But I will pass it back over to you all to discuss, and thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. The visual aids to accompany the conversation tonight were spot on. And I think we all see what we expect to see when you're underwater and seeing a thriving ecosystem. And then to end on that note with the plumes that just turn it into a sandbar, and you going in and taking a look at the impacts and thinking you have the wrong coordinates because it's completely covered in sand is very impactful. It shows the extent of destruction to this very fragile ecosystem that isn't just about fish populations and conchs, but it's all about a thriving economy for Florida as well. So right now we're going to go into a panel discussion and do some Q&A with everybody here. And I want to start first with either Rachel or Donica and ask you guys and get your thoughts on this. But, we reference Port Miami as this cautionary tale. And we've seen what destruction can happen. We know how hard it is to mitigate. A decade later, what has actually happened with those restoration commitments, and what does that tell us about what could happen this time around? And either Rachel or Donica, you can answer it.
Donica?
Well, I think Rachel kind of talked about already what happened to restore the damage at Port Miami and what didn't. A lot of it didn't happen. But I would maybe want to step back first a little bit and say, the best outcome here in terms of looking forward at Port Everglades is if we can stop or at least minimize the Corps from destroying vast acres of habitat and these species in the first place. These, as Rachel was saying, these are some of the last healthy staghorn corals that we have. And there's actually very little evidence to suggest that the Corps can just simply move them around and regrow them successfully, especially if there's ongoing sediment, sand, they're getting ongoing impacts from sand burial. But even if the Corps could recreate a chunk of reef and that they're going to destroy, I don't think they've shown in this particular instance that they have the money, the staff, the time, the experience to actually do that successfully. And so it's just really risky to go into a project with the idea that you can restore damage when you haven't really proven that that's possible on this scale. And I'll let Rachel add anything she wants to add.
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well, Donica. A lot of broken promises from Miami, a lot of broken trust, and we're left with this gaping wound on the reef that they promised to fix, and nobody has taken accountability for to fix it. So, I think one lesson for me was the power of the legal tools combined with the public engagement and the advocacy in Port Miami to raise awareness and to change the narrative such that they didn't get away with this cover up. But at the same time, it's because of the scale of the damage and the cost of the damage, it's been very hard to get accountability or even have any of the agencies write formal reports on what happened. So to start to trigger the mitigation process to happen. So that's something that we're still working very hard on. And of course, preventing the same mistakes from happening in Port Everglades is also a super high priority. But it's shocking to me that they're making a lot of the same what appear to be empty promises about how they're going to fix the damage in Port Everglades when they never fix the Port Miami project. Like, how can we be even talking about spending $2 billion dredging again when they've never closed out the permit and finished the project, the last project where they did massive damage. So it's as Donica said, while I think it's possible, it has not been proven that it's possible to mitigate corals at this scale. And the technical and staffing challenges to do it are immense. And we have never seen a plan of here's how we're going to do it, and here's how it's possible. And so, at a bare minimum, they need to make the investment in the infrastructure and prove that the mitigation is possible before they start the project. Like at an absolute bare minimum. We have lots of other asks too, but that's a big one.
Yeah. Well, and Rachel, you put in your presentation, you spoke about the boulder reefs. It's an antiquated mitigation measure that is extraordinarily costly to the taxpayers. And then there was, just you had that picture of the AI generated factory, like the magnitude that we would have to go to be able to mitigate for these impacts. Just with those two examples really shows, is this feasible, to your point? And so you mentioned briefly, like it's that legal hook. And fortunately, we're all working together with Earth Justice on that. So, that's a perfect seg. Donica, help us understand in the listeners and viewers tonight where the legal and regulatory pressure points are right now that we as conservation organizations and interested stakeholders can utilize.
Yeah, so I would say that the best legal tool we have for this particular project is the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is a really important law. It's designed to prevent species from going extinct and recover them so they don't need protection anymore. And here, the Endangered Species Act requires both the Corps and NOAA to ensure that this project will not jeopardize any species or destroy or adversely modify critical habitat. In simpler terms, that means that before this project goes forward, these agencies have to make sure that this project won't make it even harder for these species to survive and recover before they carry out the dredging. And to do that, they have to write what's called a biological opinion. And that determines whether the project is going to impede survival or recovery. It sets out certain requirements that the Corps would have to follow to implement the project, and it sets out the maximum number of individual animals like corals or whatever other species that the project is permitted to take. And here, we know that a lot of the analyses and assumptions that these agencies are using to write that biological opinion are deeply flawed and not solid. So we know that they're not based on best available science. We know that they're not incorporating all of the evidence we have from impacts from past dredging projects. We know that, like, as we were talking about, a big piece of this is that they're assuming that this project can be compensated afterwards by a huge restoration effort. And all of those things that I mentioned at the end, failure to use best available science, failure to consider past evidence of impacts, reliance on a restoration project that might not happen or might not benefit species in the way we want it to. Those are all violations of the Endangered Species Act. And we can challenge them if the agency decides to move forward without fixing that. So yeah, I'd say we're going to look at that biological opinion and make sure that it complies with the law.
Yeah. And that sounds like, at this point, it's a real opportunity. It may be narrow, but it's a real opportunity. And I ask this question to all of you because of your role in conservation advocacy. Based on, a lot of what people can do is they can contact decision makers and educate them about our concerns on this issue. So I'd love to hear from you all to say, do you think decision makers are going to be listening? And what is your recommendation to the viewers that are watching and listening tonight?
Well, I think it's critically important for people who are watching, people who care about these issues, to regularly take action to contact decision makers. And it does matter, and it doesn't take that many people to make a big difference. So we try to make it as easy as possible, and we have the stopthedredge.com page up where you can take action on this issue. And there's both signing a petition, which we have over 20,000 signatures on now, and then it will take you to a page to contact your elected officials. It matters, and it matters particularly in conjunction with the advocacy and legal tools. So all of it together with the media, the social media, the legal, the grassroots outreach that people are doing, it all adds up. And that is how we can protect these ecosystems and make our voices heard. There's another issue going on right now also that people should be aware of, and that is that the governor made a commitment to restore 20% of Florida's reef by 2050, which was really ambitious, and we applaud the initiative. And the first several years of funding, it was supposed to be a multi-year funding investment to build up the capacity to do larger scale coral restoration work. And the first few years started, and this year it appears that funding has been zeroed out for that coral restoration initiative. So the state legislature is about to go back and start talking numbers and budget numbers. So if you are contacting your elected officials, you may want to add in that you would love to see this really amazing coral restoration initiative refunded. And they're looking for about 20 to 25 million to keep it going. The infrastructure they started building, the people they started hiring, the projects that they started going, because if it's defunded this year, it's going to set everything back.
So Shayna, I'd love to hear from you. And for you all, Shayna is actually in the Riviera Beach, West Palm area. So she's about 50 miles north of the site of this dredging project, but she is not a stranger to issues confronting our coastal conservation and the ecosystems there. So I'd love to hear from you, listening to Rachel talk about, do we have the right coordinates? Are we on a sandbar? Could you imagine taking your customers out on a trip and expecting to show them this vibrant ecosystem, and instead it's has a plume of sand sediment all over it, covering it? Could you imagine that? And what would that do to your business and divers like yourself?
It would be pretty terrible. I don't think anyone wants to go diving in conditions like that. The whole point of people coming diving and snorkeling is to see the beautiful underwater world. And to one of Rachel's videos, when you're down there and it's super cloudy and murky and then looks like a moonscape, that's not why people get into the sport. That's not what they come to see. And Florida's the whole reef tract is basically the third largest barrier reef in the US or in the world. So we have this huge expanse of reef tract that's so vitally important. And people come from all over the world to dive on it, to snorkel on it, to fish on it, to recreate. We have, I think, maybe 40 species of corals along the Florida Reef Tract, 500 species of fish. It's really impressive and really beautiful, but it's under a lot of stress. And I think Rachel also had mentioned, between warming oceans and sewage outfalls and other issues that have come through with the, stony coral tissue loss disease that they actually think started with the Miami dredge that decimated corals all the way down the reef tract, even into the Caribbean. The corals are under a lot of pressure. They certainly don't need additional pressure in these huge dredging projects where there just doesn't seem to be any kind of realistic impact and any kind of realistic way to mitigate that impact.
Yeah. And I know you're involved with the business community beyond just the diving association and the dive community, but who else in the local and state economy should be paying attention to this issue?
Oh, everybody should be paying attention to this issue. Coral reefs don't just affect, divers and snorkelers and people that like to go out on the water. It's important for everyone. If you like to eat any kind of seafood at all, you probably want healthy coral reefs. If you want to have storm protection when the hurricanes and nor'easters and all of these things come through, you probably want to have coral reefs. They're vitally important to everyone. It's not just the few of us that maybe go down and look at them. So everybody should be concerned. Everybody should be involved. This is our world. These are our resources. This is, for the public, for the good of the public, for all kinds of things. So everybody should take note of this. Everybody should get involved.
Yeah, that's well said. This is definitely a public resource that belongs to all of us. And that's what's great to see out these organizations of us all working together to protect it for today's enjoyment and future generations. So what I want to talk about is the hope here. What gives, and this is for anybody, this is a free for all, even all three of you can answer this question. What gives you hope that we can actually stop this?
I'm usually encouraged by all of the people that I meet that are actively engaged and working hard in all kinds of different aspects. So, just this evening, for instance, you have multiple people from multiple backgrounds and multiple capacities working hard on these issues, smart, intelligent, bright people that I continuously meet that are working hard to make sure that coral reefs have a long-term place in the Florida Reef Tract. So that's what gives me hope, is when I meet all of these great, talented people that are working so hard. I think that people care, and that's what we have to keep pushing for.
And I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that we've already delayed this project by 10 years. Everybody sort of says it's too big to fail. And the project is going to happen, but a decade has gone by, and I think that they are using the political winds right now to try to push the project through at the moment, with potentially insufficient environmental protections. But the strategy is working to hold them accountable to doing the proper science. And when we hold them accountable to doing the proper science, the scale of the impact reveals itself. And we've only gotten more and more evidence that this reef is so critical and so special. And we don't understand yet why this reef is one of the last that has these rare species still thriving there when they're disappearing everywhere else. And in my opinion, if the Endangered Species Act is not for saving the last staghorn corals in Florida, the last wild population of staghorn corals in Florida, I should say more technically, I don't know what it's for. So I think we have a really good case here. We have really good lines of evidence, and we have really demonstrated what's at risk. And all of that, along with the public getting engaged and caring about this and making their voices heard, I think is very powerful and keeps me going.
Yeah, I would echo with what Rachel says. What gives me hope is that it's working. It's been working for the last 10 years, what we're doing. And that doesn't mean that like there's not a lot more to do and that the fight still isn't here, but we have been successful. And it's sometimes important to recognize that even in the midst of it.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to add when we all jump on calls together and we're missing from the conversation tonight, the Center for Biological Diversity and DEMA, that stands for the Diving Equipment and Marketing Association, which is a national, perhaps maybe international organization. It's international. You know, we get on these calls and Shana, you're right. There is such an amazing wealth of knowledge and passion on these calls to think about the strategy moving forward. And that's what gives me hope. And we have been successful and there's more to come, isn't there? Yes, there is more to come. So I'm going to go ahead because we're 13 minutes left and start shifting to Q&A from the general public. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and see if we have any comments that come in from online. So we have one from Alice Sager. How would the completed Port Everglades shipping channel be different than the Port Miami channel? In other words, is the proposed dredging at Port Everglades needed if Port Miami can handle the same size ships?
Couldn't have written a better question myself. Great question, Alice. This is a key question that we have posed as well to decision makers, because when the cost benefit analysis and how this works is, I'm wildly oversimplifying, but for federal projects like this, there has to be more benefit than cost. It has to be in the green. And when the cost benefit analysis for Port Everglades was originally done, they calculated all these benefits of bringing these supersized post-Panamax ships to Port Everglades. That was before Port Miami was dredged. All of the other deep dredge ports are spread out hundreds of miles apart across the eastern seaboard. You have Miami, you have Jacksonville, you have Savannah, so on and so forth. So it's questionable, and I am not an economist, but I think we can all reason that it's questionable that we would need two deep dredge ports 30 miles away from one another. And would it simply mean that we're just splitting the shipping business between the two ports now instead of creating more business for Port Everglades? And I think it is a very questionable need if Port Miami can now take those post-Panamax ships. Again, Port Miami cost about $200 million in 2013. Port Everglades is now projected to cost close to $2 billion. And the economic situation has clearly changed because Port Miami has already been deep dredged. So it's, one of our asks is that they redo the cost benefit analysis with that in mind. And that's something that we think they need to do before they move forward, because it may be in the red now.
Yeah. Thanks, Alice, for that question. Another one from Ted Weber. Is there an organizational sign-on? And we haven't really done an organizational sign-on, have we? Or have we?
I would say the best thing to do right now, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but the best thing to do right now is probably to go to stopthedredge.com and we have the drafted contact information there. If you want to get more involved, definitely reach out to one of our organizations and we'd love to hear your ideas.
Thanks, Ted. And when I read that, that makes me think of like an organizational sign-on letter, and we draft a letter and have all these wonderful groups throughout the state and the country sign on. And maybe that's a strategy or a tactic we can employ in the future. So great suggestion coming from the public. So I'm pleased, if there's anybody out there who has any questions, drop them in here and we can see them and we'll broadcast them. And until I see a new one, I've got a question for you, for all of you. If you could get one decision maker in a room for 5 minutes on this, what would you say to them?
Donica?
I would say that scientists have said that the coral reefs are the first ecosystem that's going to go extinct in the century. We're seeing that in Florida. We need to do all we can to stop that. And some of the last remaining staghorn corals are thriving against the odds next to Port Everglades, and we need to figure out how to protect them from all kinds of threats, and in particular, this deep dredge project that's going forward soon.
Shana or Rachel?
Yeah, I think. Shana?
I think I would just say, don't do it. This is a terrible decision. Anybody can look out and see what happened with a mismanaged project and how many corals were killed and the potential that it created this pathogen for the stony coral tissue loss. And they haven't even finished and fixed and tried to mitigate for what they did 10 years ago. So why just do something again at an even larger time frame and a larger scale when you didn't get the first project right, and you haven't proved to anyone that you can successfully pull off this next project without creating even more damage, especially to the last areas that really seem to be doing well or have these important species. So don't do it.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with everything you all said. I think the economic arguments here are very strong, including, our dive industry relying on our reefs. I think there's also an understanding now in science that has come out over the last year and two that corals are providing really key coastal resilience protection, as well as supporting ecotourism, fishing, pharmaceutical development, so many other things. But the estimate is that just for South Florida, an average of $665 million every year is the benefit from corals reducing wave energy and protecting coastlines from storms and coastal erosion. So that has very real significant economic benefit to Florida in a way that we are very vulnerable right now to storms, to storm surge. And we have these natural ecosystems that is there protecting the coastlines. So whatever we can do to enhance reefs and to encourage their growth, to do hybrid reefs, to do coral restoration is also an investment in our future because of the coastal resiliency aspect. In addition to, of course, all the other amazing benefits from reefs and their intrinsic value. But I would also share, fix Port Miami before and then we can talk about, what's going on in Port Everglades. But there's such a lack of trust. There are such broken promises, and there's still, this wound on the reef that has never been fixed. So I would say, as you said, Shana, don't do it. But I would say fix that one first, and then come to us and tell us you're ready to build trust and do the next one the right way. Mm-hmm. But right now, we just don't have confidence in the science and the process and the way that these projects are being handled, especially now with this sand bypass project that's supposed to be little and well controlled, has sediment going out of control. So, they need to fix what they did before they go on and do it again.
And to add to that, I'm glad you brought up the economics of it, because the Florida Reef Tract does provide something like 70,000 jobs in the state of Florida, and it brings in, I think, somewhere over $6.3 billion in tourist revenue. So it is a huge resource for the state economically. And so if we're talking about is the project in the green, what's the cost benefit? If you're going to lose $6.3 billion in potential tourism dollars and potential 70,000 jobs, it's huge.
And especially in light of how much of a positive impact it has to Florida's economy and our ecosystem, and considering that this is the country's or the United States' largest permitted destruction of coral reefs in history is flabbergasted at me for that. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of more questions real quick. How are you getting this information out to the public so they can take action and stop this madness? And I'm going to have behind the scenes, we have Federico Acevedo, our digital communications manager. I think he's most likely going to splash some links down below to answer that question directly. But Rachel, do you want to take this as well while he's doing that?
We are trying every possible thing we can do to get the word out. And, there's so many things going on in the world. It's hard to get attention. And so we're really digging deep and investing a lot in an outreach and education campaign so that people know this is happening and people who care can have ways to take action. So that's the stopthedredge.com page with the petition. We have the yellow flag with the eel, which is a little tongue in cheek. The Don't Dredge on Me flag. We have been partnering with social media influencers who are spreading the story with their networks. We're working with traditional media and press. We have taken many media organizations out diving to see the reefs and to see what is at stake and what could be lost. We just had a big story come out in the Washington Post that everybody should take a look at as well. We're hoping that people are amplifying the message. We have also folks, we actually had somebody who's an influencer in Florida reach out and say, my favorite dive site, I just went to it and it's gone. And it was removed and is now a sand pit for the sand bypass project. And so he's been helping share the information. We've been producing animations. We've been making videos. We have aerial flights flying overhead. We have reached out to all the people who live nearby the dredging project to talk to them about what's coming down the pipe and that they're going to be living next to this dredging noise, 24/7 for 6 years, and blasting is going to be happening next door. So we're even talking about doing door hangers and walking the neighborhood. Like we're trying everything possible. If you have ideas of things we have not thought of, please share them.
Crowdsource the creativity.
Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. All right. Well, unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap up and not be able to answer all of the questions here tonight. But I just want to thank all of you for the incredible conversation that we had. And I mentioned Federico Acevedo behind the scenes, as well as Morgan McClure. Without them pulling this all together and organizing all of us and having tech run smoothly. Thank you to you behind the scenes. Thank you to everybody that is listening, watching from your various platforms. Be sure to check out the stopthedredge.com. You can follow Miami Waterkeeper, Earth Justice, Center for Biological Diversity, and of course, the Florida Wildlife Federation. We are all engaged on this and working collaboratively to prevent the destruction from occurring. And just, time is of the essence. And we're really excited about the opportunities that we have coming up. If you have not connected with the Florida Wildlife Federation, please be sure to sign up for our newsletters to make sure that you stay engaged and you're current on all of our activities. And stay tuned for our next conservation discussion that we will have in May. We don't know the topic yet, but sign up for the newsletter and you will find out. And with that, thank you from all of us at the Florida Wildlife Federation, again, the panelists, and thank you everyone for your time and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.